Dr. Kerryn Reding, a nurse epidemiologist. She's a faculty member at the University of Washington, where she conducts research in lifestyle interventions of diet and exercise. Her work has predominantly focused on how these interventions apply to cancer survivors who are at risk of age-related chronic conditions as a result of their cancer treatment.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm happy to be able to provide this, this presentation, even if it is at a distance. And thank you for being here to listen. So as I talk, I'm happy to take questions. My plan is to talk for a little while and then offer an opportunity for a Q&A session about midway through, if anyone wants to ask a question at that point. I'll also provide time at the end of the presentation for question and answer, where you can ask questions on anything we've covered. If you have a question, like Julie said, and you're on the online version of Zoom, please feel free to enter your question into the chat function. And then Julie will be following those chats and will let me know if questions arise. So first, I want to start with this definition of how do we define optimal health. There we go. So what is optimal health? Well, I actually recently asked this question of undergraduate students in a class that I'm teaching at the University of Washington, and I was impressed by their answers because they talked about optimal health globally in ways that I think most of us would agree with. They talked not only about the absences of diseases, but also the ability to achieve the lives that we envision for ourselves. So to be able to live our fullest lives in a way that's not limited by any poor health. And so that really encompasses what I think of as optimal health. And it's set at an individual level because it takes into account each person's level of functioning. For one person, optimal health might mean being able to achieve a level of health that allows them to enjoy outings with their family. For another person, it could mean training for a half marathon. So we all play a role in setting what optimal health means to us. And in that sense, it's more than the absence of poor health or the absence of diseases, but also the ability to live our lives to the fullest. So that's admittedly gotten harder, right? To live our lives to the fullest with the social distancing and the stay-at-home orders during COVID-19 pandemic, mostly because we've had to corral our outdoor activities, our ability to grocery shop as freely as we'd like. And so I see that that has had an impact on people's ability to exercise as well as eat the nutritional foods that they would otherwise be striving for. So as we get to the sections on physical activity, I'm going to talk a little bit more about activities that can be done safely during the current stay-at-home orders and beyond as we continue to take measures that keep us safe. So the next question then, when we're thinking about this topic, is what evidence exists for a diet and exercise that can create that optimal health? So the evidence that exists is kind of a complicated concept, right? So as a nurse research scientist, I often approach this type of question using a systematic approach to evaluate the evidence that's currently available in the scientific literature. So as an aside, I mentioned that I recently asked a group of undergraduate students about what optimal health means to them. Well, that was actually part of a class where our whole goal was how do we evaluate the evidence that is out there in the world and in the scientific literature and how that's brought to us in the popular press, and how do we evaluate that evidence for items around our health that matter to us. That course touched on things like diet and exercise. And also it evaluated health questions from across a greater spectrum, from vaccinations as well as health-based apps. So today I'll walk you through the evidence similar to how I did in my course at the University of Washington, because it's arisen in general for ways to achieve optimal health through diet and exercise. And so as I did in my course at UW, we talked with popular press articles. And so the Seattle Times, and this was actually a resource that I have made available to you that I think will be sent out afterwards, about a year ago, published a report, and it was called The Latest Chapter in the Low-Fat, Low-Carb Debate. And it was a very well-written article that basically summarized a scientific report that came out from nutritional research scientists from across the country. And so basically, it helps us to evaluate this decision of how do we choose which diet is best for us all. So here we also need to acknowledge that dietary intake is complex. So we can start by thinking about the different components of the diet that we could focus on. We could think about the macronutrients, or the fats and the carbohydrates and the proteins that we consume. But that also then would leave out some of the other smaller items like micronutrients, like the vitamins and minerals that are contained. And it also then could focus on a caloric intake. So the calories that we're consuming that we often think about in balance with the calories then that we're expending. So as I talk today, I'm going to be providing an overview of what experts in the field think on how to create an optimal diet and how to bring that home for us. And then I'm also going to be focusing on what those experts say, particularly for seniors. So the University of Washington had a faculty member that was part of this paper that looked at low-fat, low-carb debate. And essentially, it was a group of 4 nutrition science researchers from across the country. And basically, they were interested in looking at the macronutrient question, looking at dietary fat and dietary carbohydrates, and whether there was a balance of fats and carbohydrates that we should all aspire to achieve in our diets. And actually what they ruled was there really isn't a focus, or we really shouldn't focus on the quantity, but really it was a focus more on quality. So one thing to take into note, though, was that this review article focused on reducing the risk of disease, which, as we mentioned before, is just one sliver of thinking about optimal health. But it's a good benchmark because the diseases they focused on were cancer and heart disease and diabetes. And with heart disease and cancer being the major causes of mortality, that's a great place to start. And yet it doesn't fully encompass our total functioning and our ability to live our fullest lives. But as I said, it's a good start. So essentially what this article found, and it was a great review of the literature that has been conducted over the past 40 years, it looked at what we know from that research. And it concluded that it's really the quality of the fats and carbohydrates more than the quantity, or more than any specific ratio of reducing carbs or reducing fat. And so the quality of the fats was most important. So for example, they looked at the types of fat in our diet. And what they found was that trans fats are particularly harmful to optimal health. So let's take a moment to tease apart what's taking place in this figure. So here they're plotting against the horizontal axis the incremental percent increase in the type of fat that a person consumes in their diet. And then along the vertical axis is the change in percent mortality that a person might experience. So we see the red line for trans fats shows that even a small percent increase in trans fats is a marked increase in mortality. So we see that people who consume 2% more trans fats in their diet have a 20% higher mortality. And we see basically the opposite for polyunsaturated fats, where we see that a 2% increase in polyunsaturated fats leads to about a 10% decrease in mortality. In the case that these increased and decreased risks seem maybe too large to be believed, so I'd like to point out that these data were based on a set of studies in which 126,000 men and women were followed for up to 32 years, in which assessments were made every 4 years. And this data comes straight from the Nurses' Health Study and Physicians' Health Study at Harvard. So we feel confident that the data here is solid. And that's how it was, it met the criteria for being included in this review study. So now, the take-home message from this article called Dietary Fat from Foe to Friend that was featured in the Seattle Times article. The take-home message is that prevention of disease is enhanced through an increase in the quality of our diet. So that means a replacement of highly processed foods. So refined grains, added sugars. You think of these as maybe the crackers that are highly processed in the sort of the middle sections of the grocery store, and replace those highly processed foods with unprocessed carbohydrates. So that's particularly our non-starchy veggies. So we say that because it's not necessarily replacing those crackers with potatoes, but more replacing those crackers with veggies like cauliflower, pardon me, cauliflower, broccoli, carrots, and whole fruits, blueberries and apples and bananas, rather than fruit juices. And then also legumes. So the legumes that are that we consume, like in beans, black beans and kidney beans, those produce a lot of, or those have a lot of fiber, which is great for lots of components of our health. So essentially, it's a replacement of processed foods with unprocessed whole foods. And this highlights also that these dietary recommendations are largely consistent with the Mediterranean diet. And so the Mediterranean diet has a focus on eating a wide array of fruits and vegetables, mostly in their whole food forms, as well as unsaturated fats. So fats that are found in olive oil, and eating, like I said, unprocessed foods. So foods in their whole, as a whole food. And then a variety of proteins in the forms of legumes, as well as fish, and a smaller proportion of red meats and sweets. Another component of a Mediterranean diet is eating of nuts. So not necessarily sugar-covered nuts or chocolate-covered almonds, but the actual, the almonds, the walnuts, the pecans. And so we can expand on the evidence for a Mediterranean diet if people have questions about it more in the Q&A session. But essentially, what reviews have found from the scientific literature is that a Mediterranean diet supports a lot of the aspects of health that we are striving for. And this was interestingly corroborated by a popular news press article that was conducted by the US News and World Report. So in academia and possibly in the general view, I think of this US News and World Report as a place for college rankings. So we think about how the University of Washington is looking in these rankings, and we're usually doing pretty well, but I hadn't really thought of US News and World Report as a place to look for dietary rankings. So I'll admit I was a little bit of a skeptic when I first came across this publication, but I actually was pleasantly surprised when I read about how they went about determining their list of the best diets overall. So let's bookmark sort of their methods for now, because here on this slide, I want to highlight what they found. So as you can see, the number one diet was the Mediterranean diet, and they describe its emphasis being on fruits, vegetables, olive oil, fish, and other healthy fare, which I would say includes the legumes and the nuts. And that being basically the number one diet with a ranking of 4.2 out of 5 in comparison to the next best ranked diets, which were the DASH diet, which was narrowly beat out with a ranking of 4.1 out of 5. And the DASH diet focuses on low salt intake for the prevention of high blood pressure. And also to note, third in this list was the flexitarian diet, which has been gaining popularity. And it also focuses on fruits, vegetables, whole grains, plant-based proteins most of the time. So the piece of the flexitarian diet that differs slightly from a vegetarian diet is that there is some flexibility in eating meat-based proteins or other animal-based sources of food. So it doesn't restrict the meat-based proteins entirely, which actually is pretty similar then to how the Mediterranean diet is carried out. And in that way, the Mediterranean diet can be thought of as, for the most part, eating a more pescatarian diet and occasionally having the meat-based foods enter the diet. So the methodology was to convene a panel of experts from across multiple disciplines in order for US News and World Report to come up with their diet rankings. So their evaluation process included having experts in the nutritional sciences, experts in heart disease and diabetes, and also in obesity, as well as behavioral sciences like psychology, to inform on which diets were best for people. And one of the reasons that I think this is a great way to go about it is that it's also looking at how likely are we to follow these diets. If a diet was too strict of a protocol for adherence, then the diet didn't make it to the top. And so I think that's part of the reason why flexitarian diet was able to rise in the rankings. So the ratings that each of these experts used to rate the diet was the ease of following and the impact on short-term and long-term weight loss. So I think together, these two first items take into account how likely someone is to be successful, both at initiating the diet, but also at maintaining the diet. Because in part, our willingness to continue with dietary changes depends on how well we're achieving our goals, both of adhering to that diet that we've set our goals at, but also what our goals are for making the dietary changes. So if our goal is to take on a new dietary intake pattern so that we can have short-term weight loss, to the extent that we're able to see that weight loss, we're more likely to stick with that diet. The other important things it looked at were nutritional completeness, as well as safety, so that we're not causing more harm than good with these approaches. And then also the potential for preventing and managing diabetes and heart disease. And importantly, there is evidence with these diets that made it into the top 3 that they are capable of preventing and managing diabetes and heart disease. So then I also want to describe how this fits then with the US Dietary Guidelines, because again, the US Dietary Guidelines have a strong focus on fruits and vegetables, and that's basically saying half of our plate should be made up of fruits and vegetables. There's a smaller proportion of protein, and about approximately a quarter of the plate should be reserved for grains. I think one of the issues with the US Dietary Guidelines is that it doesn't give us guidelines on what types of foods we should have within each of these categories. And that's why the deeper dive into the research literature is needed. And in that way, the Seattle Times article helps us to refine what is meant by a diet comprised of this proportion of fruits and vegetables. Because as we saw, it's not just about the quantity of these pieces in our diet, but also about the quality, as we just discussed. So recent research also demonstrates that as people age, we become less active, our metabolism is generally slowing over time, and our energy requirements decrease. So all of which means that we need to eat less than we did when we were teenagers. And because older adults' abilities to absorb and utilize many nutrients becomes less efficient over time, nutrient requirements actually increase. So taken together, this means that older adults should be eating more nutrient-dense food. And this is done so that we can counteract the natural aging process of reduced muscle mass. So we know that as we age, the body is naturally losing muscle. It's a phenomenon termed sarcopenia. So this has been characterized across many studies, and it generally impacts muscle mass and function. So an article in the Journal of Family Practice stated that sarcopenia can be considered for the muscle what osteoporosis is to the bone. And sarcopenia is a primary contributor to the functional decline in older adults. And thus the increase in protein requirements is needed to counteract this natural phenomenon of reducing muscle mass over time. We'll get back to this a little bit more as we talk about exercise, because together an increase in protein consumption and strength training exercise can help to combat this, the natural muscle loss that occurs over time. So I would now like to pause for questions if you have any. And Julie, are there any questions that came up in the chat?
No, it doesn't look like we have any questions so far.
Okay, I'll keep going.
Okay.
Okay, so next I'd like to move on to physical activity. And some of you may recognize that I have switched from the title was saying exercise, and now I'm talking about physical activity. So I've switched terminology because we often use the term physical activity rather than exercise, because exercise often connotates a planned exercise program, such as an exercise class like Zumba or a 5-mile jog, when in reality, what's most important is just being physically active. So the current guidelines, which are based on expert consensus on how often and how to move our bodies, recommends 150 minutes or 2.5 hours of physical activity per week, plus 2 days a week of strength training. So this 2.5 hours of exercise or physical activity can be comprised by a myriad of activities, such as brisk walking, swimming, dancing, golfing, pretty much you name it, as long as you're getting your heart rate elevated. So it could be achieved through yard work and other activities that we think of more as chores rather than leisure time activities. Now, switching to the strength training is suggested to take place at least twice a week and can be made up of resistance training exercises. So something like with a band that we're using to stretch and pull apart. It also can be performed using body weight exercises, like getting up and out of a chair, which we call a chair stand, or exercises with dumbbells, even at low weights of dumbbells. So the recommendations remain the same for older adults if you're able, but the Health and Human Services put out it was their Physical Activity Guidelines 2nd edition that contained physical activity guidelines specific to older adults. And essentially, this has recommended that people move more and sit less. So it's a focus on reducing sedentary time during the day. It also focuses, as for all adults, on 2.5 hours of physical activity per week. We're going to get into that detail a little bit more around what counts in that 2.5 hours. Could a stroll count, or do we really need to be getting our heart rate elevated? And if so, how do we know we've achieved that? And then also the strength training exercises twice a week at the minimum. So as I alluded to previously, because we lose muscle as we age, it's really important to try to either reverse that trend or at least slow it down. And we can do that through a variety of eating, or a variety of approaches, which involves a combination of eating protein-rich foods as well as engaging in strength training. So one thing that we're really trying to do is prevent the reduction in muscle, because we've seen that's correlated with muscle quality. And that's based on the research showing that as muscle mass declines, it's often replaced with fat and fibrous tissue, which means that our muscles no longer produce the same force that they once did. And the authors of these guidelines that came out from the Department of Health and Human Services makes the case that a multi-component physical activity plan that involves both the aerobic activity as well as this strength training 2 days per week at a minimum can help to preserve physical function and mobility, which then helps maintain independence longer and delays the onset of major disability. The authors went further to say that physical activity improves physical function in people of any age, including those who are overweight or obese, and even those who are frail. So really, finding the right physical activity that you can make part of your regular routine is the key. And furthermore, the authors make the case that for an additional benefit, engaging in extra physical activity, so doubling it to 5 hours a week, is a recommendation or a goal that we could strive for if we're able. That could be thought of as 50 minutes, 6 days a week, which really is a lot of exercise, but has so many beneficial effects that it's encouraged. So I want to continue talking about the physical activity guidelines specifically for older adults. And this was taken from this, the physical activity guidelines page. And basically what it talks about is physical activity should be a part of a weekly routine. And it should be a multi-component physical activity that includes balance training, as well as aerobic and muscle strength training activities. So the balance training is particular to older adults so that it can be used as a multimodal way to reduce the risks of falls. And so a very important point that's made here is that older adults should determine their level of effort relative to their level of fitness so that they can safely perform regular physical activity. And so they talk about older adults with chronic conditions should understand whether and how these conditions might affect their ability to do regular physical activity safely. And if an older adult can't do 150 minutes of moderate intensity in aerobic activity a week because of a chronic condition, then they should be as physically active as their abilities and conditions allow. And there's good news here, as I'm going to talk more at the end of the presentation. It's looking like, even though there is encouragement to do as much physical activity as possible, up to 5 hours a week, we really do see that there are benefits even for people who have minimal physical activity capacity. So even just being sedentary less and standing more, or even getting in just 3,000 steps per day has shown to have reductions in mortality. But the reason that we're so enthusiastic about physical activity is because it really does make a difference in our health. There are so many benefits derived from physical activity. These benefits are widespread and far-reaching, as described here. So first and foremost, physical activity increases fitness, right? So it increases the cardiorespiratory fitness, which is linked with a myriad of health benefits. Physical activity reduces the risk of heart disease, the risk of many cancers, the risk of osteoporosis, as well as the risk of depression, and as I mentioned, the risk of falls. Physical activity also improves mood. There have been a lot of studies looking at how physical activity may be essential for us, and one of that is through which our mood is affected. So then, if we narrow down a little bit to just that first bullet point of increasing fitness, research has been focusing on this and saying that it could be added as an additional vital sign when we're doing our health checks each year, because maintaining fitness may be more important than even preventing a modest weight gain. And that's because fitness is closely linked then with mortality. There was a study conducted in which 14,000 men over 6 years found that even just a modest increase in fitness led to a 15% reduction in mortality, even after accounting for body mass index. So basically saying if you took 2 older adults with the same body weight and height, and one of them improved their fitness over 6 years, that person would have reduced their risk of mortality more so than the person who did not improve their fitness. And a little bit more on fitness, it's been shown to be a stronger predictor of mortality than high blood pressure, smoking, high cholesterol, and type 2 diabetes. And in my impression, it doesn't seem to get quite its due, because we hear a lot about these other factors, smoking and high blood pressure, but we don't hear as much about the importance of maintaining fitness. And so how do we focus on our fitness? Well, as I mentioned before, the 2.5 hours per week of exercise, we need to think about the intensity of that exercise. So I want to highlight that physical activity should be of moderate intensity on a regular basis. And a good way to know what level of intensity you're reaching is to consider whether you're able to hold a conversation while you're exercising. If it's easy to hold a conversation, then it's likely to be light intensity exercise. If it's harder to talk while you're exercising, then it's moderate intensity. And if you're really unable to talk to your companion, then you're in the intensive physical activity realm. So if we can get to the point of moderate intensity physical activities, ideally 5 times a week for 30 minutes, then that's getting us toward the goal of improved fitness. And particularly for older adults, adding strength training is great. So an area of my research has been focused on strength training as a predictor of fitness. So while many times we think of aerobic activity as the way to improve fitness, the research field is gaining a better understanding of how strength training may also improve fitness. And that's because strength training can improve muscle quality and decrease muscle loss, which I mentioned before is often replaced with fat. So if we're strength training, then our muscles are better able to extract oxygen from the blood over time. And so having those higher functioning muscles with better ability to extract the oxygen, that allows our body to respond to the increased demands we place on it when we exercise. And so there's a combination then of both aerobic and strength training in order to lead to improved fitness. So the next thing I want to bring up, after all of that encouragement to really do as much as you can, I also want to highlight that low intensity physical activity is still helpful. So there have been a number of recent studies, and many of them produced by the Women's Health Initiative. So this was a decades-long study of over 160,000 women. And some of the reports coming from the Women's Health Initiative have shown that even low levels of physical activity can improve health and reduce mortality. So one of their studies showed that light levels of physical activity, such as taking 3,000 steps per day, instead of the 10,000 that we hear about and many of us strive for, a 3,000 step per day on average habit of physical activity was associated with a 20% reduction in mortality. Now, this study also showed that what they termed daily life movements were linked with a reduction in mortality. And so daily life movements were things where a person is standing and being active, but not necessarily triggering a step count. So in this study, they did some really cool research where they had older women who were enrolled wear an accelerometer, so like a Fitbit device that recorded their movement. And then they also had them wear a camera. And so they could see if someone was standing in place and being active, such as shown in this image where someone is washing carrots or doing the dishes or some other activity that requires standing but not movement, forward or backward, that might be captured on steps. That this type of daily life movement reduced mortality as well. And it's likely because this type of activity, like light household activity, is time that would otherwise be spent in a sedentary activity. And so converting that time to standing with the muscles actively engaged is beneficial for our health. So really, these sets of research emanating from the Women's Health Initiative have shown us that any movement is counting towards our health. So I also then wanted to share with you some resources, particularly for exercising at home. If you are, used to being able to go for walks around your neighborhood, and now you're feeling like even that is not something you want to engage in during the stay-at-home orders, there are some great resources for exercising at home. The AARP series called Get Moving is a fantastic set of a lot of different exercises. And here I've shown one of their videos where they're doing strength training from home, and this is using body weights. They also show that they've got a band where you could do resistance training if that's something that you've got access to. And then there's also the Silver Sneakers program put on by the YMCA that shows from home how to do chair exercises. And again, this is both aerobic and strength training, but it is capable of being done within your own home. And so at this point, I am happy to take questions if anyone has them, and I'll check with Julie to see if there are any questions that have come across the chat function.
Hey, Kerryn, I don't see any questions at this time. So if any of you have any questions, again, you can just hover over the black bar at the bottom and you'll see the chat icon, and you can just type in your question if you have one. Or of course you can email it to me and we'll get back to you.
Yeah, I would be happy to field questions over email afterwards as well. part of our social distancing approach at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that if we don't have any questions at this time, I'll keep the chat open and oh, we got a question. Excuse me. So this question is from Mike. It says, could you be more specific about what is quality food for us?
Great question. So I would say, actually, what I'll try to do is go back to my slides on, here we go, there. Are you able to see my food pyramid, Mediterranean diet pyramid slide?
Yeah. Yeah.
So to be more specific, I would focus on foods that are mostly fresh fruits and vegetables. So that being the quality is in the lack of processing to some degree. So when foods get processed, even whole grains, when they're refined into the starches that go into crackers in the store, they lose a lot of their nutrients through that. So the more that you can do, foods that are as minimally processed as possible, that really improves the quality of the food that you're eating because it retains a lot of the nutrients so that you're able to eat more nutrient dense fish or fruits and vegetables, as well as if you think about things like the fish that you're eating, as well as the protein sources being minimally processed. So if you're able to have salmon and just cook the salmon, with some herbs on top, rather than even having something else. Like I do love, a salmon spread where it's got a lot of different things added to it, kind of like a salmon salad type of thing. But eating it in its most non-processed preparation is probably best. And does that answer your question?
I'll wait for a response from him, but
do we have more questions too?
Yeah, we got some more questions. This one says, questions about supplements. Which ones are beneficial? Also, what forms of calcium what forms of calcium help in bone health?
Okay, great question. So to be honest, I approach this from the standpoint of what the research evidence shows. And supplements have not really been shown to have much impact on overall disease prevention, risk reduction for chronic conditions. So I would focus more on eating the fresh fruits and vegetables and the protein sources in their non-refined formats in order to get the nutrients that you are aiming for. I haven't looked into particular supplements around calcium, so I think that's probably something to talk to maybe a medical professional about who may be doing a little bit more keeping up to date on calcium. But I think the main thing you would want to do is make sure that it's a type of calcium that your bones, in the free form that your bones would be able to uptake.
Great. Yeah. Next, I have a question. Are high quality protein powders okay to use?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, they're all good questions. So I would say high quality protein powders, yes, I would. The types that I have looked into the most are ones that are with whey protein or plant-based protein. And I personally have been enjoying, especially during these times of stay-at-home orders, I've been having a protein shake pretty much every other day. So the protein, as long as you're looking at the ingredients and they're not too packed with sugars and other additives, I would say a protein shake that can be made with almond milk. And I actually, the way I've been having mine is almond milk, protein powder, and then some fresh fruits and veggies. So I have a smoothie with kale, avocado, protein powder, and apples, and some blueberries if those are fresh. And that basically, I think, is a great snack, and it's a really easy way to consume those types of nutrients. And so I am in support of protein-based, those protein powders. That's a way to get protein. And I've focused on whey protein, like I said, as well as plant-based proteins.
Great. And to follow up with what Mike asked, he's wondering if you could give us some examples of fruits and vegetables and beans that are the
Oh,
best source.
sure. So I'll also add to that the nuts that I think that are great sources. So fruits and vegetables, I would focus actually on eating a variety. I probably wouldn't say that there's any one or two or five that you could focus on, but I would say getting a variety so that the different nutrients each of those has, you're getting kind of on a regular basis. So I mentioned I'm a fan of kale. I've heard kale be called the superfood. Kale is a great source, and so if you can incorporate that into your diet, but then also, like I said, with the variety, then you'd also want to mix that up with some spinach and some chard and different types of dark green leafy vegetables in a kind of a variety of those. One of the best ways that I've thought about this, and I think this image that's shown here describes it well, is to eat a rainbow of vegetables and fruits. So you think about the beets that you can incorporate more, the carrots, the broccoli, and trying to get as many different sources so that you're really getting a complete set of nutrients is ideal. From the category of beans, I would say, again, I probably would recommend the same thing around a variety. I think one of the best parts about beans is their fibrous content. And so most beans are going to be in that category. So I've been really enjoying cooking with beans currently during the COVID stay-at-home orders, partly because they're easy to preserve. I've been getting more beans from the store. I've been really enjoying soaking my own cassoulet beans and having those with rice and a vegetable stew. So I would say black beans, kidney beans, white beans. I think also the thing that might be potentially a way to go is to try a variety of different types of recipes so that it feels like there's enough interest and variety in the foods you're eating. And I had a great cannelloni bean salad the other day. So I think it's trying to eat a variety, but also mostly in that context, it's the fiber of the beans that is beneficial. And then I would say nuts. So the nuts that I would focus on are the walnuts, the pecans, and the almonds. Those are a great source of protein and, again, fiber. And sometimes we worry about, the oil content, but really those are the healthy oils. And that goes also with the avocado, because avocados have healthy oils in them. It's the omega-3 fatty acids that our bodies need, that our brains need for optimal health. So I threw in a bonus there of which types of nuts I think as well.
Great. Thank you. One question here says, do you know of any exercise sources for people with arthritis?
Oh, that is a great question. I do not off the top of my head, but I would be happy to look into that and get back to you on that. So I could send a follow-up email to Julie.
Yeah, that'd be great. Looks like one last question. Should supplements be taken separately, or is it okay if you take them all together?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure about that. I could look into it and get back to you. There are some supplements that have, they're a multivitamin, right? So they've got a lot of supplements in one, and certainly those have been investigated for the ability to take them together. But if you are mixing and matching and making your own, set of supplements to be taken at once, I could look into it and reply again to Julie to let you know my thoughts on that.
We can include the answer to those two questions in our follow-up email that we send out to the participants for today. All right. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kerryn. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, pleasure.
So I would say if we have no further questions, I think we'll be ready to wrap this up. Like we said earlier, I will email a copy of the slides to all of you along with our speakers' contact information. We will also include a survey sheet we'd like you to fill out and let us know about your experience with the Zoom event today. Like I said, we're kind of experimenting with this technology. This is my first time hosting a meeting, so I appreciate your guys' patience. But I think it's a really great way to be able to connect with folks, so I really appreciate your time. Yeah, so if there's nothing else from you, Kerryn.
I just saw a question. I pulled up the chat and I see that someone asked about dairy. And it's true, I
Oh,
didn't really touch on dairy much. Um, so I think one of the interesting pieces about dairy is that for a long time we focused on the low fat versus high fat component of dairy. And it's been an interesting area of research because there's been some conflicting evidence about whether or not a high fat or low fat dairy is good for us. I think in general, what the Mediterranean diet recommendations would say is that it needs to be in the smaller proportion of food category. So it's one of my friends who's a nutrition researcher, she tells her son that there are sometimes foods. And so I think cheese is like a, you know, a full fat brie is a sometimes food, you know, not an everyday food. And so what basically what the research has shown is that the dairy fat actually is not as much what we should be focusing on, but more about, again, it's more about the quality. So the grass-fed dairy is particularly good for us. So to the extent that you can find grass-fed, you know, so dairy from grass-fed cows, that's supposed to be really healthy for us because, again, it contains more of those omega-3 fatty acids. And then again, you know, with the Mediterranean diet example, eating it in smaller quantities, but feeling okay about having the higher fat dairy every once in a
great. Thank you so much.
while.
All right. Well, thank you again, Kerryn. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So again, my name is Julie Robb with Ida Culver House Broadview, and thank you guys so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.